For decades, Hollywood westerns painted a simple picture of the American frontier. The brave white hero always rode into town to save the innocent. Villains were easily recognizable, and every story ended with justice triumphing over evil. Audiences accepted these tales as part of American culture, never questioning the myths they reinforced or the stereotypes they quietly normalized. Then, in 1974, one movie stormed into theaters and shattered every rule that audiences had come to expect. That movie was Blazing Saddles, a film that refused to play by Hollywood standards and instead laughed directly in the face of tradition. It wasn't just another comedy. It was an outrageous, fearless satire that attacked racism, mocked the Western genre, ridiculed politics, and even tore apart the illusion of filmmaking itself. Some viewers laughed until they cried, while others walked out of theaters completely shocked. Even today, more than 50 years later, people still argue about whether a movie like this could ever be made again. Yet hidden beneath all the unforgettable jokes, controversial dialogue, and legendary performances lies a collection of stories that most audiences have never heard. Behind the scenes, the production was filled with risky creative decisions, casting disasters, deleted scenes, studio battles, and one mysterious mistake that remained unnoticed for decades. Those hidden stories reveal that the making of Blazing Saddles was every bit as chaotic as the movie itself. To understand why the film became such a cultural phenomenon, it's important to look at the America into which it was released. The early 1970s were a period of enormous uncertainty. The Vietnam War had finally come to a painful end, leaving the nation deeply divided. The Watergate scandal had destroyed public confidence in political leaders, and President Richard Nixon was on the verge of resigning from office. Although the civil rights movement had achieved major legal victories, racial prejudice remained deeply rooted throughout society. Hollywood, despite portraying itself as progressive, continued producing westerns that almost always centered white heroes while reducing black characters and Native Americans to stereotypes or background figures. Mel Brooks looked at this landscape and decided he wasn't interested in making another ordinary western. Instead, he wanted to completely dismantle the genre from the inside. His goal wasn't simply to entertain audiences with silly jokes. He wanted to expose how ridiculous racism truly was by making people laugh at its absurdity. The premise of the film sounds almost unbelievable. A greedy politician and corrupt land developer devise a scheme to force the residents of a small frontier town called Rock Ridge to abandon their homes. Their solution is simple: appoint a black sheriff, believing the racist townspeople will panic and flee. They assume prejudice will accomplish what violence cannot. Instead, their carefully designed plan falls apart because the new Sheriff Bart turns out to be far smarter, calmer, and more capable than anyone expected. Rather than surrendering to hatred, Bart outwits every enemy standing in his way. What begins as a cruel political trick gradually transforms into one of cinema's most unforgettable comedies, filled with absurd situations that constantly surprise the audience. Beneath every ridiculous gag lies a serious message about ignorance, discrimination, and the foolishness of judging people based solely on race. That balance between outrageous comedy and meaningful social commentary became the film's greatest strength. However, creating that balance required enormous courage, because Brooks knew he was stepping into dangerous territory. Mainstream audiences in 1974 had never experienced anything quite like this. The film openly used offensive language, not to promote hatred, but to expose the ignorance of racist characters. It featured crude humor that most studios considered completely unacceptable. It placed a confident, intelligent black hero at the center of a genre traditionally dominated by white protagonists. Every scene challenged expectations. Every joke risked provoking controversy. Brooks understood that satire only works when it refuses to play it safe. If the audience felt uncomfortable at times, that discomfort served a purpose. It forced viewers to confront ideas they might otherwise ignore. Much of this bold approach came from the collaboration between Mel Brooks and legendary comedian Richard Pryor. Long before cameras started rolling, Pryor worked closely with Brooks to shape the screenplay. His influence extended far beyond individual jokes. He helped transform Sheriff Bart into a character who never allowed racism to define him. Bart wasn't portrayed as a helpless victim or an angry revolutionary. Instead, he remained calm, intelligent, witty, and constantly aware of the absurd situations surrounding him. Pryor originally hoped to play Bart himself. Many believed he would have delivered an unforgettable performance because his fearless personality perfectly matched the film's rebellious spirit. Unfortunately, the studio refused to approve his casting. Executives considered him too risky because of his personal struggles and legal troubles involving drug use. Insurance companies declined to cover him, making it impossible for Warner Brothers to allow him to star in the production. It was a heartbreaking decision that completely changed the direction of the film. Instead, the role went to Broadway actor Cleavon Little, whose smooth confidence and understated humor gave Bart a unique personality. Rather than matching Pryor's explosive energy, Little approached the character with remarkable composure. His calm delivery made every sarcastic remark even funnier because he rarely appeared rattled, even when surrounded by complete madness. That subtle performance became one of the film's defining qualities. Brooks also surrounded himself with performers who embraced creative freedom instead of rigidly following the script. Improvisation became part of everyday filming. The more audiences laughed at Blazing Saddles, the more they overlooked how close the movie came to becoming something entirely different. Hidden inside early scripts, production notes, and interviews were scenes that never reached the final cut, not because they weren't funny, but because even Mel Brooks wondered if they had crossed a line that audiences simply wouldn't forgive. Considering Brooks had already packed the film with controversial language, racial satire, and crude humor, that says a great deal about just how daring these deleted moments really were. One of the most talked about lost scenes centered on the flirtatious relationship between Sheriff Bart and the glamorous nightclub singer Lily Von Stupp. In the finished movie, their chemistry is playful and suggestive without becoming overly explicit. The sequence is memorable, funny, and perfectly fits the movie's tone. Originally, however, Brooks planned to take that encounter much further. According to later interviews, after Bart and Lily share a romantic dinner, the lights fade, leaving the audience listening only to their conversation in the darkness. Lily, speaking with her exaggerated German accent, asks Bart whether the stories she has heard about black men are actually true. She wonders if they are really as physically gifted as the stereotypes claim. The audience is intentionally left waiting in silence before Bart delivers an unexpected punchline that completely reverses expectations. Instead of confirming or denying the stereotype, he calmly reveals that Lily has completely misunderstood the situation. The joke instantly transforms an offensive stereotype into an absurd misunderstanding, exposing how ridiculous such assumptions truly are. Even by modern standards, the scene would have been incredibly risky, blending race, sexuality, and satire into a single joke that demanded the audience understand the deeper point behind the humor. Brooks later admitted that although he believed the joke worked, he worried it might overshadow everything else the movie was trying to accomplish. Rather than laughing at prejudice, some viewers might think the film was simply relying on offensive stereotypes for cheap laughs. That uncertainty convinced him to remove the sequence before release. Yet it wasn't the only controversial material left behind. Other early drafts included dialogue that pushed the flirtation between Bart and Lily even further. In one version, Lily encourages Bart to remove his ammunition belt, delivering the line with obvious double meaning that leaves little to the imagination. Another draft reportedly had her become far more curious about the stereotype she had mentioned earlier, attempting to satisfy that curiosity herself before Bart calmly dismisses the entire situation with effortless confidence. Instead of portraying Bart as embarrassed or flattered, Brooks wanted him to remain completely unimpressed, allowing Lily's obsession with stereotypes to become the real target of the joke. That subtle reversal reflected one of the movie's biggest themes. Racism survives because people believe myths without questioning them, and Brooks repeatedly used comedy to expose how foolish those myths actually were. Years later, Brooks confessed that part of him regretted cutting some of those scenes. Looking back, He wondered if he had become overly cautious after spending so much of the production pushing boundaries in every possible direction. In one interview, he even admitted that perhaps he became afraid people would misunderstand what he was trying to say. That fear wasn't entirely unreasonable. Satire depends on audiences recognizing who the real joke is aimed at, and not everyone interprets comedy the same way. A joke intended to mock prejudice can easily be mistaken for prejudice itself if viewers ignore the context surrounding it. Brooks constantly walked that tightrope throughout the making of Blazing Saddles. Every decision required balancing outrageous comedy with meaningful commentary, ensuring that the laughter always pointed toward ignorance rather than encouraging it. That careful balancing act explains why the finished film remains so fascinating decades later. It isn't controversial merely because it uses offensive language or shocking jokes. It's controversial because it weaponizes those elements against the very people who believe them. Instead of asking audiences to feel comfortable, the film repeatedly forces them to confront uncomfortable realities before immediately turning those moments into laughter. Brooks understood that laughter could sometimes accomplish what lectures never could. When people laugh at something, they also begin recognizing how absurd it really is. That philosophy shaped nearly every scene in the movie, including those that never reached theaters. Deleted scenes often reveal what filmmakers originally wanted to say before compromise changed the final product. In the case of Blazing Saddles, they reveal just how fearless Brooks truly was. The material he removed wasn't discarded because it lacked creativity. It disappeared because he worried it might distract audiences from the larger message hidden beneath the outrageous humor. Ironically, those missing moments have become part of the film's legend precisely because they were never seen. Fans continue imagining what the movie might have looked like had Brooks left everything untouched. Would audiences have embraced it anyway? Or would the controversy have buried one of the greatest comedies ever made? No one can answer that question with certainty. What remains clear is that the scenes audiences never saw are just as revealing as the ones they did. They demonstrate that Blazing Saddles wasn't built around shock value alone. Every outrageous joke served a larger purpose, challenging old ideas, exposing hypocrisy, and refusing to treat prejudice as anything other than ridiculous. Yet while Brooks carefully chose which jokes stayed and which disappeared forever, another unforgettable moment entered the film completely by accident, creating one of Hollywood's strangest behind-the-scenes stories without anyone realizing it until years after the cameras stopped rolling. The most unforgettable scene in Blazing Saddles isn't the dramatic showdown between heroes and villains or the outrageous finale that crashes through Hollywood itself. Instead, it's a simple campfire sequence featuring a group of hungry cowboys eating baked beans. On paper, the scene sounds completely ordinary, but what happened next permanently changed comedy history. As the men finish their meal, they begin passing gas one after another, creating a chorus of perfectly timed sound effects that had never before been heard in a major Hollywood motion picture. Today, the joke feels harmless, but in 1974 it was considered almost unthinkable. Major studios believed audiences would reject such crude humor, insisting respectable films simply didn't include realistic flatulence. Mel Brooks disagreed completely. During early test screenings, viewers laughed so hard that many of them missed the dialogue following the first few sound effects. Instead of reducing the joke, Brooks made an even bolder decision. He returned to the editing room and added additional sound effects, making the sequence even louder and more ridiculous. Studio executives were horrified. They described the scene as vulgar, childish, and completely unnecessary, arguing that it lowered the quality of the entire production. Brooks ignored every complaint because he understood something they didn't. The joke wasn't really about bodily functions. It was about destroying one of Hollywood's oldest myths. For decades, Western films had portrayed cowboys as fearless, handsome, clean-cut heroes who somehow managed to spend weeks riding across dusty landscapes without ever looking tired, dirty, or human. Brooks wanted audiences to remember that real cowboys weren't polished legends. They were ordinary men who slept outdoors, ate simple food, smelled terrible, and behaved like actual people. By replacing romantic fantasy with ridiculous reality, he quietly dismantled decades of cinematic tradition using nothing more than a campfire and a handful of perfectly timed sound effects. That willingness to embrace absurdity extended far beyond a single scene. Brooks encouraged an atmosphere where accidents weren't feared but welcomed. Instead of demanding rigid perfection from his actors, he allowed improvisation to flourish. Cast members frequently experimented with dialogue, facial expressions, and comic timing, discovering hilarious moments that never existed in the original screenplay. Gene Wilder, playing the mysterious Waco Kid, often adjusted his delivery in subtle ways that made ordinary lines unexpectedly hilarious. His calm, almost effortless performance balanced the film's louder moments, giving audiences someone who reacted to complete insanity as though everything happening around him were perfectly normal. Cleavon Little contributed just as much through silence as he did through dialogue. His facial expressions often communicated more than entire pages of script could have achieved. Rather than overacting, he remained composed while everyone else descended into chaos, making Bart appear not only intelligent, but almost impossibly patient. Brooks recognized these performances immediately and encouraged his actors to trust their instincts instead of following every word exactly as written. That freedom helped create one unforgettable moment that no one planned at all. During the film's climactic finale, the fictional world completely collapses. Characters burst through studio walls, invade neighboring movie sets, interrupt musical performances, and spill into the real streets surrounding the Warner Brothers lot. It remains one of cinema's earliest and most ambitious examples of breaking the fourth wall. Yet hidden within that carefully choreographed madness is a tiny detail that escaped almost everyone. As actors race through the studio gates and into the street, an ordinary man wearing everyday clothes casually walks across the frame. He isn't dressed like a cowboy. He isn't wearing makeup. He doesn't react to the running actors or the cameras surrounding him. That's because he wasn't part of the production at all. He was simply a passerby who unknowingly wandered into the middle of filming. Under normal circumstances, such a mistake would force directors to stop production immediately and shoot the scene again. Brooks looked at the footage, laughed, and made a surprising decision. Leave him in. The stranger's complete lack of awareness somehow made an already ridiculous sequence even funnier. Without intending to, he became part of one of the most celebrated comedies ever made. Decades later, viewers still notice him for the first time and wonder whether his appearance was scripted or accidental. In reality, it perfectly represented Brooks' philosophy that comedy often becomes strongest when life refuses to cooperate with careful planning. That same unpredictable spirit appears in another unforgettable sequence featuring a group of Native Americans who unexpectedly begin speaking fluent Yiddish instead of an indigenous language. The scene initially resembles every traditional Western encounter between settlers and tribal warriors, leading audiences to expect violence or conflict. Instead, Mel Brooks, who personally played the tribal chief, completely overturns expectations. Hearing Native American characters casually speaking Yiddish feels so unexpected that laughter becomes almost unavoidable. Yet beneath the absurdity lies another layer of satire. Hollywood had spent generations portraying indigenous people as mysterious outsiders, while rarely treating them as fully developed human beings. By replacing their expected dialogue with a distinctly Jewish language, Brooks highlighted how artificial those old portrayals had always been. He wasn't mocking Native Americans. He was mocking Hollywood itself for reducing entire cultures to simplistic stereotypes. The joke worked precisely because it refused to follow familiar patterns. Brooks understood that audiences laugh hardest when expectations collapse without warning. Even the film's opening theme reflected that philosophy. Rather than hiring someone known for comedy, Brooks invited legendary Western singer Frankie Laine to perform the title song. Laine approached the recording as though he were singing for a serious epic adventure, delivering every lyric with complete sincerity. Brooks deliberately avoided telling him the film was a comedy because he knew absolute seriousness would make the exaggerated lyrics even funnier.